The deed felt like a joke in her hand, a thin piece of paper holding the weight of a lifetime of servitude. The Sterlings had called it a bequest, a final act of charity for the orphan girl who had served their table and mended their clothes for 18 years. Opal knew it for what it was, a final dismissal. A small, forgotten parcel of land outside a town called Promise Creek, a place they'd bought on a whim and never seen. The lawyer had read the will in a room thick with the scent of lilies and smug satisfaction as the Sterling children inherited stocks and silver. To Opal, he'd simply said, "The deed to the old Miller place, it is yours, clear title." Then he'd slid it across the polished mahogany, careful not to let his fingers touch hers. Promise. Creek was a collection of dusty buildings staring at each other across a wide, rutted street. The liveryman had looked at the name on her deed, then at her worn dress, and laughed. "The Miller place? Girl, that ain't been a place for 20 years. It's a ruin." He wasn't wrong. The cabin sagged, its spine broken, the porch tilted like a drunkard. Weeds choked what might have been a garden. But standing apart, square and proud and built of stone and thick timber, was the granary. It was solid where everything else was collapsing. And on its heavy oak door hung a lock, a great black knot of rusted iron. The liveryman had told her the story, of course. Jedediah Miller's wife Elspeth had died suddenly. A fever. Jedediah, mad with grief, had locked up her prized granary and simply walked away. Some said he'd died in the mountains. Others said he'd just kept walking east. Nobody had touched the lock since. It was a monument to a man's sorrow. For 3 days, Opal circled it. She slept in the one corner of the cabin where the roof held, wrapped in her only blanket, eating the last of her bread. The granary drew her gaze, a question mark in the center of her desolate inheritance. The town pitied her, the same way they pitied stray dogs. Mrs. Abernathy from the general store had given her a cracked pot and a handful of beans, her eyes full of the kind of sympathy that stung worse than scorn. "Nothing to be done with that place, dear," she'd said. "Best move on before winter." But there was nowhere to move on to. This ruin was the only thing on earth that was hers. On the 4th morning, the sky a pale, cold blue, Opal made a decision. She'd spent her last dollar on a pair of bolt cutters at the smithy, the smith himself shaking his head as he took her money. "Waste of a good dollar, miss. That lock ain't the only thing rotten out there." She stood before the door now, the cutters heavy in her hands. The air was still, holding the scent of dust and decay and the faint, sharp smell of distant pine. The town was a story she was supposed to accept. The ruin was a fact she was supposed to surrender to. But the lock was a choice. Her hands, raw from clearing weeds, trembled slightly as she opened the jaws of the tool. This felt like a violation, like breaking a promise she hadn't made. The metal of the lock was cold against the cutters. She squeezed. Her arms shook with the effort. The rust fought her. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan and a sharp crack that echoed in the morning quiet, the shank of the lock gave way. It fell to the dirt with a dead thud. Silence rushed back in. Opal's heart hammered against her ribs. She had done it. She had broken the seal of a dead man's grief. She put a hand on the door. The wood was rough, weathered to the texture of stone. She pushed. It resisted, swollen in its frame. She put her shoulder into it, grunting with the effort. It scraped back an inch, then 2, opening a dark slice into the interior. And that's when she heard it. It wasn't a creak of wood or the skittering of a mouse. It was a soft, living sound, a gentle stirring from within the dark. A rustle, a coo, a sound like silk being dragged over silk. It was a sound of life inside a place the world had declared dead. Opal froze, her hand still on the door. Her breath caught in her throat. The liveryman had said nothing lived here. Mrs. Abernathy had said it was empty. The lock had promised it was sealed. But the lock had been wrong. She pushed the door again, wider this time, her fear warring with a fierce, defiant curiosity. A thick bar of sunlight cut through the gloom, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. The air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of ancient dry grain and something else, something musky and alive. And as her eyes adjusted, she saw them. Not rats, not owls, pigeons, dozens of them. They weren't the gray, common birds of the town square. These were magnificent. Some were as white as fresh cream. Others had feathers that shone with the iridescent green and purple of an oil slick on water. They had fantails, feathered feet, crests like tiny crowns. They blinked at her from the high rafters, their heads cocked. For 20 years, they had been here, a secret kingdom thriving on spilled wheat and oats from the crumbling bins along the walls. A flock of impossible jewels locked in a box of sorrow. One fluttered down, then another. They weren't panicked. They were curious. One landed on a broken crate near her, its chest puffed out, its color a deep, rusty red she'd never seen before. It looked at her with an intelligent, dark eye. As she watched, mesmerized, a sudden flurry of movement in a corner caught her attention. A single bird, one of the creamy white ones, was on the floor, dragging a wing that bent at an unnatural angle. It tried to fly as the others stirred, but only flopped in a painful circle, its soft coo now a note of distress. Without thinking, Opal knelt. She moved slowly, her hands outstretched, palms up. "Easy now," she whispered, her voice husky from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." All the years of being quiet, of moving through the Sterling's house like a ghost, had taught her how to be small, how to be unthreatening. She approached the injured bird, her movements fluid and slow. It watched her, its panic giving way to a wary stillness. She was inches away when a shadow fell over her, blocking the light from the door. A man stood there, tall and broad, silhouetted against the bright morning. He filled the entire doorway. For a heart-stopping second, she thought it was the ghost of Jedediah Miller himself, come to reclaim his sealed grief. "What are you doing here?" The voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It wasn't angry, not exactly. It was rusted, like the lock she had just cut. Opal didn't look up. Her focus was on the bird. "It's hurt," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. She reached out one finger and gently stroked the feathers on the bird's head. It flinched, but didn't pull away. "This is private property," the man said. His boots scuffed on the threshold. He took a step inside, and the spell of the dusty sunlight was broken. He was real. He wore worn denim and a faded flannel shirt. His face was weathered, bracketed by lines that spoke of sun and hardship, and a dark, untrimmed beard. His eyes, though, were the most startling thing. A clear, pale gray like a winter sky, and they were fixed on her hands with a strange, unnerving intensity. "It's my property now," Opal said, her gaze still on the pigeon. She finally managed to scoop it up, one hand holding its body steady, the other supporting the broken wing. The bird trembled but settled against her, its warmth seeping into her cold skin. Only then did she rise and face him. He was taller than she'd thought. His stare was heavy, unsettling. He looked from her face to the bird nestled in her hands, and something shifted in his expression. The hardness in his jaw softened by a fraction. "The Miller place," he said. It wasn't a question. "The deed is in the cabin," she said, her chin lifting slightly. She would not be intimidated. This was hers. This strange, dusty, feather-filled space was hers. The man's gaze swept the granary, over the impossible flock of birds now settled back into the rafters, watching them. A look of profound, deep-seated pain crossed his face. so raw and unguarded it made Opal want to look away. He looked at the empty hasp on the door, then at the broken lock lying in the dirt outside. "You cut the lock," he stated, his voice flat. "I did," Opal said. She held the injured bird a little closer, its heart beat a frantic rhythm against her palm. He didn't speak for a long time. He just stood there, a man carved from silence and sorrow, looking at the life she had just let into the light. His name, she would learn later, was Dutch. And the woman who had loved these birds, the woman whose death had sealed this door, had been his wife. He wasn't a ghost. He was the grief itself, still living and breathing on the edge of town, and Opal had just broken into the house of his heart. He finally looked back at her, at the way her hands cradled the injured pigeon, her touch firm but gentle. Respect warred with anger in his eyes. "That wing needs to be set," he said, his voice still rough, but the grinding edge was gone. It was the first crack in a wall that had stood for 20 years. Dutch did not offer to help, nor did she ask. He simply watched, his presence a heavy weight in the corner of the granary as she worked. She found a clean corner and gently set the pigeon down. Her past life had been one of mending, of fixing what was broken, a torn shirt, a cracked plate, a child's toy. A bird's wing was different only in that it was alive. She tore a strip from the hem of her spare petticoat, found 2 thin, straight twigs from a fallen nest in the rafters, and with a focused gentleness that silenced the man in the corner, she set the tiny bone. The pigeon struggled only once, a brief, panicked flutter, but Opal's low, steady murmur seemed to calm it. She wrapped the splint, her fingers deft and sure. When she was done, she made a small, soft nest for it in a wooden crate, away from the others. She looked up to find Dutch staring, not at the bird, but at her hands. He looked away quickly, his jaw tight. "There was water in the rain barrel," she said, more to herself than to him. She found a broken piece of crock and filled it, placing it near the crate. "They need feed," he said gruffly, turning to leave. "That grain is nothing but dust now." He paused at the door. "Elspeth called them Birmingham rollers. They fly so high they look like specks, and then they tumble out of the sky, all at once." He said the name, Elspeth, as if it was a stone in his mouth. Then he was gone, leaving Opal alone with the dust and the birds and the ghost of a woman she had never known. The next morning, a burlap sack of high-quality corn and seed sat on her porch. There was no note. There was no sign of him. It was a silent offering, a concession. Opal carried the heavy sack to the granary, her heart a little lighter. She spread the feed on the clean, swept floor, and the birds descended in a soft thunder of wings, their jewel-toned heads bobbing as they ate. They were not afraid of her. It was as if they knew she was their keeper now. She spent her days making the place hers. The cabin was a lost cause for now, but the granary she could save. She swept away 2 decades of dust and droppings. She patched the holes in the roof with shingles she salvaged from a collapsed shed. She cleaned the nesting boxes, her hands growing calloused, her face smudged with dirt. She was no longer the pale, quiet servant girl. The sun was browning her skin, and the work was putting muscle on her arms. She felt a strength in herself she had never known. She named the granary the Dovecote, because it sounded beautiful, like the birds themselves. The injured roller, which she called Pip, began to heal. It would sit on her shoulder as she worked, a warm, living weight. She talked to it, telling it about her life with the Sterlings, the endless gray days, the feeling of being invisible. The birds were the first thing that had ever truly seen her. Dutch kept his distance, but he was always there, a peripheral presence. One afternoon, she saw him on the ridge that overlooked her property, just sitting on his horse, watching the pigeons wheel and tumble against the vast blue sky. He thought she hadn't seen him, but she had. Another morning, she found the broken handle on the old well pump replaced, the new wood smooth and expertly fitted. She knew it was his work. Their encounters were brief and filled with unspoken things. He'd ride the fence line that separated their properties, and she would be there, checking on a loose post. "The birds are flying well," he'd say, his gaze on the sky. "They are," she'd reply, her eyes on his hands, which were always busy, mending a wire, testing a post. Strong, capable hands. One evening, as dusk was settling, painting the sky in shades of lavender and rose, he appeared at the dovecote door. He held a small, leather-bound book in his hand. "This was hers," he said, holding it out. "Elspeth's. It's about the birds." Opal wiped her hands on her apron and took it. The leather was soft, worn with use. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, callous touch that sent a jolt through her. She opened it. Inside, in a neat, elegant hand, were notes on bloodlines, feeding schedules, and remedies for sickness. And on the first page, written in a slightly different, bolder script, was a name. Dutch. Elspeth had written his name in her book. "She was teaching me their names," he said, his voice quiet. He pointed to a drawing of a bird with a distinct white patch over one eye. "That one's Patches. The big red one is Copper." He knew them. He knew them all. "Thank you," Opal whispered, her throat tight. This was more than a book. It was a piece of his history, a piece of his heart. He was trusting her with it. "She would have liked you," he said, his gray eyes holding hers for a long moment. "She always took in strays." He didn't mean it as an insult. It was a simple statement of fact, but it landed in her heart with the warmth of a true compliment. He turned and walked away before she could find the words to reply. She stayed up late that night, reading the journal by the light of a single candle. She learned about the birds, yes, but she also learned about the woman who had loved them. Elspeth's notes were full of life, of passion for her flock. She wrote about the joy of seeing them tumble, the worry over a sick chick, the pride in a new color. And woven through it all was Dutch. "Dutch helped me raise the roof beam today. Dutch found a hawk's nest and moved it, so the birds would be safe. Dutch says they are just pigeons, but I see the way he watches them." Opal felt a pang of jealousy for this woman she'd never met, for the love that shone so clearly from these pages. She was living in the shell of that love, and the man who was its other half was a ghost on a nearby hill. She was tending his wife's birds, sleeping in a cabin on his wife's land. The thought was unsettling. She was an intruder. The next day, she found a small, intricately carved wooden bird on her porch, a perfect replica of Pip, the roller she had healed. The wing was carved in the splinted position. It was a gift, acknowledgement. She put it on the mantel in the cabin, next to the broken lock. They were building a language, she and Dutch, a language of silent gifts and shared work. Her quiet world was shattered by the arrival of a polished black buggy that looked entirely out of place on the rutted track leading to her cabin. A man in a city suit and bowler hat climbed down, his face a mask of condescending appraisal. It was Mr. Sterling, the man who had been her master for 18 years. "Opal," he said, his voice oozing a false warmth that turned her stomach. "My dear girl, we were so worried to come out to this wilderness." "I am fine, Mr. Sterling," she said, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. She stood on her porch, making him stay in the dirt. Pip, who had been pecking at crumbs near her feet, retreated into the cabin. "So I see." His eyes flickered past her to the repaired dovecote, where the flock was murmuring softly. "We heard a most peculiar rumor in town, that you had found something of value here." "I found some pigeons," she said, her voice cold. "Pigeons?" he scoffed, but his eyes were greedy. "I'm told they are quite unusual. A man in town, a Mr. Abernathy, said they might be worth a great deal to the right collector. So, the talk had started. The value. The price. The one thing that had never occurred to her. "They are not for sale," she said. Sterling's smile tightened. "My dear, there has been a misunderstanding, a legal oversight. The bequest was meant to be a temporary sanctuary for you, not a permanent transfer of property. This land is still technically part of the Sterling estate." Ice flooded Opal's veins. "The deed has my name on it. The clerk registered it." "A clerical error, I assure you. One my lawyer is prepared to rectify. Of course, we are prepared to be generous. We will compensate you for your trouble and allow you to return to your old position. Your room is just as you left it." The thought of that small, airless room under the eaves, of the life of silent servitude, made her feel sick. "No," she said. The word was small, but it was solid. It was the strongest thing she had ever said to him. Sterling's face hardened, the mask of civility dropping away. "Do not be a fool, Opal. You are an orphan with nothing. I gave you a roof over your head. This property, and whatever is on it, is mine. You have 1 week to pack your things and vacate." He climbed back into his buggy and was gone, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of his threat hanging in the air. For the first time since arriving, Opal felt true fear. She had built a small, fragile life here, and he was going to smash it. She had the deed, but he had money and lawyers and a lifetime of believing she was nothing. That evening, she saw Dutch on the ridge again. She wanted to run to him, to tell him, to ask for his help. But what could he do? And what right did she have to ask? She was the one who cut the lock. She was the one who had disturbed his peace. This was her fight. She didn't see him for the next 3 days. The silence from his direction was more unnerving than Sterling's threats. The sack of feed on her porch remained full. He had withdrawn. The world she had started to build was shrinking back to the size of her own fear. She spent the days reading Elspeth's journal, searching for an answer that wasn't there. She found one entry near the back. "Jedediah Miller died today. A good man. Dutch went to the auction. He bought my little plot, the one with the stone granary. He said a woman should have a place that is hers and hers alone, a place to keep the things she loves. He put the deed in my name. My name. Elspeth Miller. I feel like a queen." Opal read the words again and again. Elspeth's land. Dutch had bought it for her. So the Sterlings had never owned it. They had sold it. The bequest was a lie. A cruel, deliberate lie. They had given her something that was never theirs to give, assuming it was worthless. The knowledge was a weapon, but she had no idea how to wield it. She was a servant girl. He was Mr. Sterling. Who would believe her? She needed proof. The county records office was in a town a day's ride away. She had no horse, and her week was almost up. On the 6th day, a man with a hard face and a badge pinned to his vest rode up. He was the county sheriff, and Mr. Sterling was with him, looking triumphant. "Miss," the sheriff said, his voice devoid of warmth, "I have a court order here. You are to vacate the premises immediately. Mr. Sterling is the legal owner." "That's not true," Opal said, her voice shaking. "He sold this land, years ago, to Elspeth Miller." Sterling laughed, a short, ugly sound. "The ramblings of a desperate girl, Sheriff. She's squatting. Look at her." The sheriff's eyes were cold and dismissive. He saw what Sterling wanted him to see, a poor, vagrant girl clinging to a ruin. He didn't see the repaired roof of the dovecote, the clean-swept yard, the healthy, gleaming flock of birds. He didn't see the home she had made. "You have 1 hour to gather your personal effects," the sheriff said. "Then I am escorting you off this property." Despair, cold and absolute, washed over Opal. She had lost. She had dared to build something, and the world had reminded her of her place. She looked past them, toward the ridge where Dutch so often sat. It was empty. He had abandoned her. The pain of that was sharper than the fear of being homeless again. He had seen her, seen the life she was bringing back to this place, and he had chosen his silence. He had chosen the ghost of his wife over the living woman who was trying to honor her memory. She went into the cabin, her movements stiff. She had so few things: her spare dress, the cracked pot from Mrs. Abernathy, Elspeth's journal, and the small wooden bird Dutch had carved. She wrapped them in her blanket. When she came out, two of Sterling's hired men were carrying crates toward the dovecote. "What are you doing?" she cried. "The birds are part of the property," Sterling said smoothly. "A collector in Philadelphia has made a most generous offer. He was going to sell them. He was going to take Elspeth's living legacy, her joy, and turn it into coin." The thought was unbearable. Pip, her heeled roller, flew from the cabin and landed on her shoulder, pressing against her neck, its small body trembling. "You can't," she whispered. It was all she had left. The sheriff took her by the arm. "It's time to go, miss." His grip was firm, impersonal. This was it. The end. She was back where she started, with nothing but a bundle in her arms and a cold, empty road ahead. The townspeople had started to gather at the edge of the property, drawn by the commotion. She could see Mrs. Abernathy's worried face, the liveryman's curious stare. They were watching her being cast out, just as the Sterlings had cast her out before. The humiliation was a physical blow. Then, a voice cut through the air, quiet but carrying an authority that made every head turn. "Let her go." It was Dutch. He wasn't on the ridge. He was walking up the track from his own property, his stride long and purposeful. He wasn't the withdrawn recluse anymore. He was tall and straight, and his winter-gray eyes were fixed on the sheriff's hand on Opal's arm. The sheriff, surprised, released her. Dutch stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat from his body. He didn't look at her. Not yet. His gaze was on Sterling. "This land was never yours to give," Dutch said, his voice resonating with a power no one in Promise Creek had heard from him in 20 years. Sterling sputtered. "This is a legal matter, settled by the court. It has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," Dutch said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a packet of folded yellowed papers. "This is the original bill of sale dated 1892 from your father Sterling to me. And this," he held up another document, "is the deed, filed and recorded, transferring ownership from me to my wife, Elspeth Miller. This land hasn't belonged to a Sterling in over 2 decades." A gasp went through the crowd. Mrs. Abernathy put a hand to her mouth. Sterling's face went pale, then purple with rage. That's a forgery. The court order was based on a lie," Dutch said, his voice dropping, becoming dangerous. "A lie you told because you thought no one was left who remembered the truth. You thought this place was worthless. You used it to get rid of a girl you owed a debt to, a girl my wife was fond of." He finally turned to Opal, and his eyes were full of a terrible apology. "Elspeth left a letter for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She saw you in the Sterling house, saw how you were with the animals, how quiet and kind you were. She told me if anything ever happened to her, this place and the birds were to be yours. I couldn't. After she was gone, I couldn't bear it. I locked the door and I buried the letter. Stopping felt like a second death, but letting it stay dead was worse." He held out a sealed envelope. Her name was on it, in Elspeth's elegant script. For Opal. Opal took the letter, her fingers trembling. She had saved him. By cutting the lock, by refusing to leave, by loving the birds, she had forced him to face the grief he had sealed away. And now he was saving her. He was giving her back her home, her life. He was giving her a history, a belonging she never knew she had. Pip, the pigeon on her shoulder, cooed softly and rubbed its head against her cheek. It was a seal on the moment, a living testament to the truth. The bird she had healed was claiming her, right in front of the man who wanted to sell it. Sterling looked from the papers in Dutch's hand to the letter in Opal's, to the crowd of townspeople whose faces had turned from pity to contempt. He was beaten. Without another word, he turned, shoved his way through his own hired men, and fled toward his buggy. The sheriff, looking deeply uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Seems there's been a mistake," he mumbled, and followed him, leaving the crates and the lies behind in the dust. Opal stood there, clutching the letter, the little wooden bird safe in her bundle, the real, living bird warm on her shoulder. She looked at Dutch, at the man who had stepped out of his own shadow to stand in the light for her. The wall around him was gone, and in its place was a man who was just as lost and found as she was. He had rescued her from destitution, and she, with a pair of bolt cutters and a gentle hand, had rescued him from a prison of his own making. The why of the granary was not just about death and sorrow. It was about a promise of love that had finally, after 20 years, found its way home. The seasons turned. The harsh lines of winter softened into the green promise of spring. The dovecote, once a monument to grief, was now a hub of constant, gentle life. The Birmingham rollers, fat and happy on good feed and clean water, soared and tumbled in the high blue air, their movements a daily ballet that drew the eye and lifted the spirit. Opal's cabin was no longer a ruin. Dutch had appeared one morning with a wagon full of lumber and, without asking, had begun to repair the roof. She had watched him for a moment, then picked up a hammer and worked alongside him. They didn't talk much, but the shared rhythm of the hammers was a conversation all its own. They raised a new porch, straight and true. They replaced the cloudy, cracked window panes with clear glass that let the morning sun stream in. The house became a home, filled with the smell of baking bread and the scent of the wild roses Dutch helped her plant along the fence line. Elspeth's letter, which had confirmed everything Dutch had said and spoken of a quiet hope that Opal would find a good life, was framed and hung on the wall. Next to it hung the deed, her name clear and strong. On the mantel, the heavy, rusted lock she had cut sat next to the small, intricately carved wooden bird. One represented a door broken open, the other, a heart tentatively unlocked. Dutch was no longer a recluse. The change in him was slow but steady, like the turning of the earth. He started joining her on the porch in the evenings, a mug of coffee in his hands. At first, they would just sit in comfortable silence, watching the last of the pigeons settle in for the night. Then, he began to talk. He told her about Elspeth, not with the raw pain of a fresh wound, but with the gentle fondness of a cherished memory. He told her how his wife had traded a pair of prize-winning geese for her first 2 pairs of rollers, how she had stayed up all night with a sick bird just as Opal had. She'd be so happy, he said one evening, his voice quiet as they watched Pip, his wing now perfectly healed, leading the flock in a final dizzying tumble. To see them so well cared for, to see you here. Opal felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. She gave me a home, Dutch. You both did. You made it a home, he corrected gently. It was just a place with a ghost in it before you came. The town, which had first mocked her, then pitied her, now respected her. Mrs. Abernathy would save her the best cuts of bacon. The liveryman tipped his hat and called her Miss Opal. They saw her not as the Sterling's cast-off, but as the woman who had faced down a rich man and won, the woman who had brought the Miller place back to life. They saw the way Dutch's gaze followed her, the way the hardness had left his face, replaced by a quiet contentment they hadn't seen in 2 decades. One afternoon, he found her in the dovecote, sketching the birds in the back of Elspeth's old journal. He didn't say anything, just leaned against the doorframe, watching her. The sunlight from the open door caught the gold in her hair and the earnest concentration on her face. "I remember when my father lost our farm," she said, not looking up from her drawing. "I remember the auction, the way people laughed when he bid on his own horse with his last $2. I never understood how a place could just stop being yours." "Some places never stop being yours," Dutch said. He crossed the space between them and gently took the journal from her hands, setting it aside. He took her hands, his large, warm palms enveloping her smaller, work-roughened ones. "Opal." He said her name, and it was a promise. It held the quiet evenings on the porch, the shared work of the hammers, the silent gifts left for each other. It held the memory of a broken lock and a healed wing. "This place was always meant for you," he said. "And I think I was too. I just didn't know it until I saw you kneeling in the dust, holding that broken bird like it was the most precious thing in the world." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, slow-burning recognition. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and wood smoke and the end of a long, lonely winter. It was the feeling of a door swinging open not on a room full of ghosts, but on a future. When he pulled back, her heart was beating a steady, sure rhythm. Pip landed on the doorframe above them and let out a soft coo. Dutch smiled, a real smile that reached his winter-gray eyes and filled them with light. "Seems we have his approval," he said. They walked out of the dovecote and stood looking at the home they had built together, at the land that was now vibrant with life. The story of the Granary had been a sad one, a town legend of love and loss. But stories could change. A new chapter had been written, one of courage and kindness, and a love that had risen from the dust of old sorrows. Opal looked at Dutch, at the strong, gentle man beside her, and knew she had found more than a home. She had found where she belonged. And as the sun set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley, they knew that a lock, once broken, could sometimes let in more light than was ever thought possible. They had found in each other a quiet ritual of healing, and in this small corner of the world, they had discovered a love that was worth more than any man's price. A love that was, in itself, the true inheritance.